Welcome back, students. We're continuing our presentation on Modular 4 and moving into the topic of social and economic justice for women. It's important to recognize that even though there have been tremendous strides in terms of equal rights for women, there is still discrimination that's occurring. One of the most predominant ways that women experience discrimination is in terms of comparable wages. Comparable worth is defined as the concept that persons should receive equal pay for the same type of work, regardless of their gender. As is often stated, equality for women means equal rights, not more rights than what men have. So let's continue to take a look at this as a particular issue. So gender and income for women, you've probably heard that men are paid more than women are paid over their lifetimes. But what does that really mean? Is it because women are paid less because they choose to work at lower paying jobs? Is it because more women are working part-time? Is it because women have more caregiving responsibilities? What exactly does gender bias have to do with paychecks? So there is this concept of what is identified as the pay gap, and that is taking a look at a comparison between women and men and the typical earnings for both women and men doing the same job. It can be compared by weekly earnings or annual earnings. And the most recent data that I was able to secure shows that in California, the median annual earnings for full-time year-round workers looks like this in 2019. Excuse me. So you can see the difference between what males were earning, what females were earning. The earning ratio, women are making about 86% of what men were making, which when you take a look at it from a dollar perspective is about 86 cents for every dollar paid to men, which amounts to an annual wage gap of $7,227. So definitely something that impacts families. We know we have a significant percentage of the population that are women-held or women-headed households. So women are maybe the primary or exclusive individual in the family that's bringing money into the family. And so when you see this distinction between how much a female earns and how much a male would earn, you know that it's going to be impacting her and her family. According to the American Association of University Women, the pay gap will not close, meaning we won't see these things start to come together more effectively until 2152. Women of color earn less than Caucasian women. So now when you start to bring in ethnicity or race into the equation, you start to see even more distinctions between white women and women of color. The gender pay gap is worse for mothers and grows with age. Women in every state and in nearly every occupation experience the pay gap. In some states, it's worse than others. More education helps increase women's earnings, but it still doesn't completely close the gender pay gap. So here's a graphic that shows a comparison of the pay gap between white men, white women, African-American women, and Hispanic women. And you can see that as you move down the spectrum from white men to Hispanic women, you can see how the pay gap begins to demonstrate itself by less earnings based on gender and then finally based on ethnicity. So variety of different issues that surround gender. We know that men hold leadership positions in professions that predominantly employ women. So in a lot of areas where women are overwhelmingly the largest number of individuals who are employed, they often are not moving up. It's called the glass ceiling, it's been referred to. So they're not being promoted and often are being supervised by male supervisors. Over 80% of all social work practitioners are women, so that's always an interesting thing to be aware of. And I've certainly seen that in my classes where the vast majority of the students who are interested in social work are often female. Slightly more than 15% of state governors are women. So you're beginning to see that reflected in a variety of different ways in terms of state governors. State legislators, about 25% are women. And then in the most recent election in 2020, we saw the largest influx of female federal legislators at both the House of Representatives and in the Senate as well. So things are changing. Again, clarifying some terms around social and economic justice issues for women. We know that sexism is a negative differential treatment of individuals because of their gender or sex. Sexism can affect any gender, but it's particularly documented as affecting women and girls. It's important to recognize that men can experience sexism as well. So anytime there is a negative or differential treatment of an individual because of their gender or sex, whether it be male or female, that would be classified as sexism. So if a male is working in an environment that is predominantly female and is experiencing feelings of being either not being respected or not being regarded well, and there seems to be an indication that it's because he's male, then that would definitely be considered sexism. Sexism results in prejudice, stereotyping, or discrimination, often against women or girls, may include the belief that one sex or gender is superior to another. And in the most extreme version of sexism can often foster issues around sexual harassment, rape, or other forms of sexual violence. So defining sexual harassment is that unwelcome sexual advances, requests for sexual favors, or other verbal or physical contact of a sexual nature that affects a person's employment, job performance, or creates an intimidating or hostile work environment. So certainly, again, this can be either sexual harassment directed towards a female or a male. Historically, we've seen it more frequently being directed towards females, and it's really focused on the request or the requirement of issues around sexuality as a way of being able to secure advancements or other types of opportunities in terms of employment. We want to talk a little bit about social and economic justice for women and how it relates to reproductive rights. So when we talk about reproductive rights, we're talking about the rights for women to be able to manage their own reproductive health, to make decisions about when they want to have children, to make decisions about whether they want to become pregnant. Those kinds of issues is what we refer to as reproductive rights. So some people might frame the issue related to reproductive rights as a conflict between the status of a human embryo and a woman's right to privacy and choice. This is probably what the argument around abortion comes down to, is who has more legitimacy or who has more rights in terms of the human embryo, the unborn fetus, or the woman who is the one that finds herself in that situation. Other issues include rights of minors, men and medical determinations such as risk of women's health, third trimester abortions, and emergency contraception. So when you talk about reproductive rights and you're talking about minors, it's the idea of should a minor be able to access reproductive health services without their parents' knowledge or consent. In the state of California, and if I'm not mistaken, I think throughout the United States, a person is able to secure reproductive health services, so birth control, STD testing, at the age of 12 or older. I'm sorry, 12 or older. And the reason why that particular age was chosen is that it's important to recognize that we have seen 12-year-olds who have become pregnant, and so it's unfair and it's unjust not to be able to provide a 12-year-old who is sexually active with all of the resources that they need in order to be able to prevent a pregnancy, an unplanned pregnancy, from happening. Issues around men, there's often a very strong argument that says that if you are talking about a decision about whether to continue or to terminate a pregnancy, that the male that's involved should have just as much to say as the female. There's definitely different considerations, as the fact that the man is not going to be pregnant for the next 9 months, but there's some school of thought that says men should have an opportunity to voice their concerns, to be able to assert their rights and be able to be involved in that particular situation. And then medical determinations, when you're talking about things like women's health and third trimester abortions, emergency contraception, that really goes to a woman, again, feeling that they're the ones who have control over their body and what's going to happen to their body, and particularly when it comes to reproductive rights. So it's important to recognize that social workers often have very different viewpoints on issues related to reproductive rights, and that the social work profession supports compassion for client self-determination, and appropriate referrals regardless of personal views or personal beliefs. So what that means is that a social worker is obligated to provide a client with the whole array of possible services, help the client explore what their various options are, help them work through their decision-making process. Again, not telling them what decision to make, but simply to help them navigate through those complicated and difficult decisions, and then to support the client in terms of the decision that they make. That decision that the client makes may be contrary to what your personal decision would be in that situation, but this isn't your situation. This is the client's situation. And client self-determination, the client's ability to be able to make their own choice, and for a social worker to support them, is a fundamental part of what social work is all about. Just highlighting a few things to be familiar with relative to social reform, particularly within the feminist movement. We obviously saw the 19th Amendment to the Constitution enacted in 1920, which gave women the right to vote. The Civil Rights Act of 1964, which we're going to talk about in a few more slides down. The other one that was critical in terms of women's rights was the Equal Rights Amendment. This was a proposed amendment to the US Constitution to assure the complete and equal rights of all citizens without regard to gender. It's interesting to note that whenever you're proposing an amendment to the Constitution, it has to go through a ratification process, which means that every state has to vote on it. And there's a certain number of states, I believe it is more than 3/4, I believe is the threshold. So at least 3/4 of all the states have to approve this, and they do it by voting in one of the elections. And when that happens, then they are able to add that as an issue or as an element of the Constitution. What was interesting about the Equal Rights Amendment is that from the point that it was initially proposed and until it was finally became law, was a series of quite a long period of time. There was a period of time where it was very successfully being supported state by state. And then we saw sort of a backlash and some propaganda that began to be kind of communicated out in the world about what this was going to mean in terms of women and women's roles, and how it was not necessarily maybe in the best interest for women. And then you started to see states not passing it. And it eventually got to a point where it looked like it was not going to be ratified if we were going to go through this state's process. What finally did occur is that Congress voted on it, and it was adopted in 1972. So they kind of overrode, the traditional process that's used for an amendment to the Constitution, and they simply ratified it by the lawmaking process. It's important to recognize that both the National Association of Social Workers and the CSWE support social and economic justice for women in many ways, the Council on Social Work Education. So moving away from women and beginning to take a look at sexual orientation as a social and economic justice issue, excuse me. Again, let's do some definitions here. So sexual orientation, this is the direction of one's sexual interest towards members of the same, opposite, or both sexes. Persons who are gay, lesbian, or bisexual experience prejudice, oppression, and discrimination. And that's often manifested in what's identified as homophobia, which is the negative emotional reaction to homosexuality or persons who are homosexual. It's important when you begin to think about sexual orientation to be familiar with what's referred to as the Kinsey Scale of sexual behavior. So Kinsey proposed that there was a continuum of sexuality that ranged from 0 to 6, and you can see from this slide. And what you can see is that there are variances and gradients of different levels of sexuality that range from exclusively heterosexual to exclusively homosexual behavior. And that some people are going to fall on either sides of the spectrum, but some people are also going to fall somewhat in the middle. There are people who would identify themselves as bisexual, which means that their sexual attraction is to both men and women. There are folks who have had occasional same-sex relationships or been involved in same-sex sexual encounters. So all of those, and the idea is that everybody sort of falls on someplace on this scale in this continuum. One of the things that was fundamental in terms of social and economic justice for gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender folks was the fact that sodomy laws were declared unconstitutional in 2003. So you might ask, what is a sodomy law? Well, a sodomy law, which was operational in a number of different states, particularly in the South, declared that certain sexual behaviors, primarily oral sex and anal intercourse, were unlawful, that you could literally be arrested if you were caught, I guess, practicing either oral sex or anal sex. The thing that's interesting to take a look at is the fact that oral and anal sex is not something exclusively only the practices of people who would be identified as either gay or lesbian or bisexual. heterosexuals practice oral and anal sex just as much as anybody else. And so literally anybody in any of those given states could have been arrested because you were breaking the sodomy laws. Well, the Supreme Court declared that sodomy laws were unconstitutional in 2003. So that was very much sort of a first push effort to try to say that we're not going to try to penalize or discriminate against people who are in same-sex relationships. Currently, only 33 states have hate crime legislation that includes sexual orientation. But we've also seen some successes. The rights and benefits of same-sex couples has always been hotly debated, but progress has been made towards achieving parity with heterosexual couples. So marriage equality was passed in 2015, and gay and lesbian parents also may experience discrimination. We're going to talk more about that in a coming up session. So continuing on, we will pause there, and when we pick things back up, we'll start to talk about the issue of class relative to social and economic justice.